Hello there and welcome to the Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley. My name is Traxter Dupre. We're still on summer break until August 15th. We will resume this show with a new segment and commentary on what's happening live to tape. August 15th is coinciding with a new Drax Files video as well. Excitement. Anyway, today we're playing another great interview while Joe is absent, of course, somewhere in 1920s Berlin, re-engineering her entire sim and mesh. We're playing an interview from the archives with Emily Short, maker of interactive text adventures. Briefly within Linden Lab, when under CEO Rod Humble, her team developed the iPad app Versu. She will talk about that as we conducted the interview. It was originally broadcast in show 23. Right when the Versu technology that allowed characters in a novel to behave in many different ways, depending on the reader's choices, the technology was given back to Emily and her partner Richard Evans, and the novel Blood and Laurels was released back then, marking the first release in using this pretty amazing literature engine. I learned a lot when I talked with her back then because I had no idea how these things work. Some would argue I still don't. But in my ignorance back then, I have to admit, I kind of put them all in the same category as my sort of choose-your-own-adventure books that I loved in the 80s. But there's considerably more to this. But you be the judge. Listen to the interview. Is this just a slight digital improvement over choose-your-own-adventure books, or is this actually the path to AI avatars or agents, if you will, that store our personality and maybe live on forever when we load them into a machine? I won't bother you with the housekeeping notes this week. You know the drill. Great suggestions, by the way, are coming in. How to improve the show and how to improve the website. And we are going to work on it, I promise. In the meantime, visit the sponsors and tell them you come through us. I know the website is not perfect. You have to scroll all the way down. The WordPress theme sucks. But come on, we're on vacation. So here's Emily Short addressing the history of the project that became Versu and was purchased by Linden Lab in 2013.
The background of this project is that Richard Evans, who was the lead AI engineer on Sims 3, had some ideas that he'd wanted to develop kind of that came out of some of his earlier AI work in terms of really getting deeper into the social aspects of characters. And in contrast to the way that in The Sims, the characters sort of stand around and talk gibberish to each other, or Simlish, and you can't really see what's going on at a social level very deeply. He wanted to explore what would happen if he developed the simulator in a direction that really delved into types of social interaction, social practices, and what kind of behavior is appropriate to do in different contexts. And he also had the experience working on some of the other sort of video game style projects that he'd done up to that point, of finding that there were nuances that the AI could express that he wasn't able to get across with animation and graphics, because if you have a character who is doing something in a particular way, or the AI is telling you, this character feels this way about their action, if you want to express that in text, you just add a single word or two of adjective or adverb to go into that sentence. Whereas if you're trying to present that in a graphical context, you would need a whole bunch of extra animations, and suddenly that just balloons the cost of creating that nuance. So he came to me, since he knew a little bit about what I had done in terms of modeling conversation for text-based interactive fiction. And we worked together on that project as little text people, and then started approaching people who might be interested in investing in the project or picking us up. And that was the point that we got acquired by Linden. And that was very exciting. We were brought in and started sort of directing the project towards what would fit in, particularly with the idea of having shared creative spaces and that kind of concept. As you probably know, we came out with some initial apps. We had an app that was just called Versu, but in which you could download additional stories. And we had some sort of Jane Austen's themed content and an office comedy themed content. And we had kind of discovered that mode of presenting our content wasn't doing as much for us as we would like. We really wanted to be able to build standalone stories that then could be individually marketed, and we could sort of push them as the particular genre that they were and that kind of thing. We thought that would be a better fit. And I started working on Blood and Laurels, which is this big Roman political thriller. We'd gotten to a point where we had those apps ready to go. Blood and Laurels was actually 3 days out from the launch date. I started talking to journalists, all that kind of stuff, when Linden decided to take a different direction as a corporation as a whole, and didn't really see us fitting into that anymore. And so at that point, they let us go from that project. And that was that was not a great moment for me. I was fairly sad to see that happen, especially because, having it happen right at a moment when I felt like we were going to be able to show something that was a dramatic improvement on our earlier work was kind of heartbreaking. But these things happen.
At that point, you were, it could have never seen the light of day, right?
Right. And I was really, I was afraid that was what was going to happen. And initially, I made them an offer to just acquire the entire sort of package, the IP and so on. And we couldn't really come to terms on that. And it looked like it wasn't going to go anywhere. And that was depressing, but what do you do? So just kind of wanting to move on. And at the same time, I still felt a lot of camaraderie with a lot of people at the lab. Our team at Linden had been great and very supportive. So it wasn't like I was angry at people. It felt like we'd sort of hit this unfortunate no-win scenario where, our interests and theirs were not going to line up in a way that we're going to promote the project to be able to go on. But happily, I can't really go into sort of the nitty-gritty of the arrangement, but happily that changed and we were able to come back to the negotiation table and work something out. And Ebbe was very, very helpful with that. So, I'm hugely appreciative that we were given that opportunity to work something out with them that was going to serve both sides.
So interactive fiction, can you tell, because this is really a genre that I didn't know anything about. What is the state of interactive fiction now? If you can give me an overview, what's the fan base, what's the niche, and also what's the competition and what you're doing here with interactive fiction?
The sort of background that I come out of is sort of 1980s text adventures that were being released by Scott Adams and Infocom, and in other countries, Magnetic Scrolls and Melbourne House, all of those. That created a tradition of games that were about typing commands into the computer to navigate a space and solve puzzles and interact with characters. And I really loved those as a child. And then in the early 90s, they kind of, because the growth of games with graphical engines took off so much, most of the big text adventure companies kind of died out or started doing other things at that point. And so people who are still enthusiastic about that format, either because they really enjoyed how sort of open-ended it was to explore that space, or there's something they liked the text of it. I've always liked to read and write, so the fact that it has a text interface is appealing to me. That group of people sort of moved to bulletin boards and to Usenet and continued building their own tools for creating these stories with initially shareware and then just for free, and sharing them around. And they developed their own zines and places where people would post reviews and a big archive of everything that people had written. And it became kind of this very underground community. It didn't have any particular exposure to the rest of the world. It was hard to find, especially before the web. It was not immediately obvious where to even encounter this, even if you might have been interested in it. The flip side of that was that it was a very tightly knit community of people who were really interested in the juxtaposition of sort of classic game design, like how do you make fun puzzles and how do you reward the player and give them a good time, with sort of more literary concerns, like how do we portray characters in an interactive context? How do we give somebody the experience of seeing the world from somebody else's point of view? Maybe we want to give them a viewpoint character who understands the world differently than the average person would, all of those kinds of things. And so it became kind of this hotbed of discussion about how to do interactive story in a way that would be, still compelling and enjoyable, and at the same time accomplish some of the goals that we associate more with literature than with gaming.
I played around with the Versu app, and my wife also really enjoyed it. And I'm so impressed with the literary content that you basically have to put in there, let alone all the AI functions. If you don't have a compelling story with compelling narrative and something that satisfies the literary fiction consumer, they're going to throw it in the garbage, I suppose.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, my background is, first of all, largely academic. I was trained as a classicist. I have a PhD in classics. I spent a couple of years teaching Greek and Latin at small colleges in the Midwest before the economy collapsed, basically. But I also, before starting on Versu, had done, 10-ish years of writing interactive fiction, which was very much based in, just can you create compelling descriptions of things? Can you put the player in a situation that where they want to see the end of the story? All of those kinds of concerns.
I read a lot, and when I find a compelling game, my first criticism, or something that always puts me off, is that just the type of story, the quality of the words, of the flow, just that quality is to me not enough very often. I'm throwing everything into one bag here, but like, let's say a really cool, a graphic, high intense graphical game, even if the dialogue is not on par with something that I read in a good novel, I can't stand it.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and I certainly have that reaction sometimes myself to things. In defense of professional game writers, I feel like I have to throw in a couple of remarks about that. One is that often people who are in the position of actually writing that content are brought onto the project kind of late, and that means that they're not in the position of being able to kind of shape the whole work thematically as much as they might like. And so that makes it more difficult to kind of work the nuances into the story that they otherwise might have been perfectly capable of crafting if they just had the space to do it. But the other thing about it is, especially if you're writing dialogue or story content for an MMO with quests or for a shooter where the player has to go do something, your writing has to carry a lot of weight of a particular kind that it doesn't have to carry if you were writing a novel. Because in addition to conveying the character and the emotion and creating all of that, you also need to communicate to the player exactly what they need to do quickly. And so you've got this sort of tension between, a lot of good writing from a novelistic point of view is about sort of subtlety and subtext and not being too on the nose and making people, letting people sort of understand what a character is concerned about without just having them come out and, blurt it out in the most obvious way. In contrast, if you're trying to give somebody instructions about your quest is X, you don't want them to have to think too hard to understand what the instruction is. Experienced game writers have talked about how they kind of structure dialogue barks in order to suit the context. And it's sort of, the first thing the character says has to be a direction so that the player knows what to do. And then if you want to get into more expressive sort of characterizing comments that can follow after, but you have to accept the fact that in some of these types of games, the player may not stand around to listen to multiple lines of dialogue. They may get their question and leave that NPC and go do something else. So, I mean, it's a really hard job.
It's a challenge when you go for a certain style, a certain literary style. You have to break out of it to then, when you come to the juncture where the reader or the player has to make a decision. Or do you write it in that same style to keep the flow going?
I mean, I think it's possible to invite interaction in a way that still belongs to that same flow. I realize you haven't had an opportunity to see Blood and Laurels yet, but I think it handles that a little bit more smoothly just because the prose style is a little bit less sort of intentionally old-fashioned, although the context of the story is this ancient historical period. The feel of it is less about sort of comedy of manners in fancy language and more, there's a lot more sort of, here's a plot situation that you've been thrown into that is extremely problematic and you're going to need to deal with it. And it has, I mean, just sort of in terms of length of plot, it has a great deal more incident and a lot more sort of forward movement. And the prose also, I mean, when you've got a plot that is trying to move forward at a higher pace, you also want the prose to reflect that by being a little bit more immediate, a little bit less archaic and all that kind of thing.
You really answered my question. I mean, I was derailing you and as a very convoluted way. The only thing that I was just wondering, how do you guys deal with when you write in the voice of, let's say, Shakespeare or Goethe, and then you break out into, so what's up now, dude?
I mean, I think the trick is, first of all, I would not say that I am capable of emulating Shakespeare, let alone Goethe. But again, there are certain constraints about how you can write the options for the player, because it can't be too long a piece of text because it needs to fit in this menu, and it needs to be clear about what the player is going to do and what the player should expect is going to be the result. Because it's really easy to write menu options that sound kind of generic, and then the player picks it and their character says something that was not what they expected to say at all. I've had this happen to me a lot in sort of video games with standard dialogue trees where, the dialogue option is something like, challenge so-and-so. And you think, oh, I'm just going to say that I disagree with him. That's what I'm expecting as the player. But then it comes out as this really like insulting thing from the protagonist. So, especially given how much of Versu is about creating sort of social nuance and these interactions between characters, we have to try really hard to make the menu options be as clear as possible. What's the tonality? Like, if you're going to say something, is that going to be funny? Is it going to be flippant? Is it going to be rude? Like, what kind of thing is going to come out? So that does put a lot of constraints on the prose style, but I think it's going to be a little bit less contrasty with the output, just because the output is also a little bit more sort of colloquial and forward moving.
Earlier, I asked you to kind of summarize what the scene is like right now. Are there people who do a similar thing that you guys are doing?
Yes and no. There are people who are doing interactive story of various kinds, some of which is commercial. There are the choice of games people do, sort of really big choose your own adventure type experiences. Silkwords is a choose your own romance website. There are a couple of other things. Fail Better Games does interactive stories that also have imagery with them. But I would say there's really nobody who is trying to commercially explore the space of text-based characters who have this kind of responsiveness. I think we're uniquely positioned in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And it's really incredibly impressive that potentially, or you're going that way, where there is really the characters, they can evolve in infinite ways. Is that right?
Well, infinite sort of oversells it. I'm not quite willing to say that.
So there is a finite number of permutations.
There are finite permutations, yes, but lots and lots nonetheless. So to give you some idea, in Blood and Laurels, there's over 240,000 words worth of authored content. And by that I mean, sort of specific dialogue that's been written and specific scene transitions and that sort of thing, narrative describing what happens. Out of that, a player on a single playthrough is only going to experience about 15,000 words. So that means you're seeing in your experience about 7% of the total text that could have happened. So obviously there's a lot of room for that story to shape itself around what the player chooses to do. And then on top of that, the core, even if you saw similar text to somebody else, you saw the same strings, you might see them in different contexts or in a different, slightly different shape, because the underlying AI of character relationships means there are a number of different characters that you could wind up being friends with, wind up having a romantic relationship with, wind up being enemies with. You might wind up killing them or having them kill you, or wind up married to them at the end. So there are lots of different ways that those things can play out that sort of stitch together the simulation level with the hand-authored content.
So how long does it take you to just write that story?
It would have taken me, I don't know how long, years, but one of the exciting developments that happened in the Versu project last year was that we got a new authoring tool that allowed us to write the dialogue portions and the scene portions sort of as though you were writing a play script. And they had a little bit more markup than that. So you would do things like say, this character is angry when they say this, and that tells the simulator what to do and that kind of thing. But that meant that I was able to write the content in 2 or 3 months rather than over the course of multiple years.
A clarification with the underlying prompter engine. Is Blood and Laurels, in fact, the first novel that came out with this, that runs on this engine?
The simulator that decides what behavior the characters should have, and the praxis language that writes for that has existed since before we were acquired. Prompter was then developed while we were at Linden. Prompter creates praxis code, and then that runs through the simulator. that happened while we were there, but Blood and Laurels and Bramble House are the first two pieces that actually make use of that.
This is all the speculation that's obviously happens now is what does Linden still own? Can they also make use of this? Then it's sort of a win-win maybe for both parties, but I don't want to press you to unveil anything that you can't.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I would if I could go into more detail, but there's a non-disclosed clause in the contract. So.
Where do you see, I was just thinking because I was at the SVVR conference and everybody has the goggles and everybody's like, whoa, now I'm in it, I'm immersed and as a Second Life enthusiast, I had many discussions that I feel very immersed in Second Life 2, although there is this screen between me, but now we're talking about text. Where do you see this going, or what would you say to a 23-year-old who says, not something that doesn't have a head-mounted display is not really immersive?
First, I'd like to say, Versu, the core engine doesn't necessarily have to result in text output forever. If you're sort of doing the R&D side of how do we even make this work convincingly, doing it in text is the obvious way to start that process. But we've had many conversations about the possibility of hooking it up to other types of front ends, other types of game engines, embedding Versu technology as an element in something else. So that's something. And whenever I give presentations about Versu, I also always have people come up to me with ideas about what other types of ways they would like to skin this kind of capacity. Like they want to use it for business training, or they want to use it for education, or they have their own game idea that they want to do, but they want it to look different. That potential is out there, and other people have talked to us about it. We've talked to each other about it.
And I expected, what I expected you to say? So kids, read a book. It can be total immersion.
I would also say that the text is still freaking awesome. And there are some things that you can do with it that genuinely are hard to communicate in other contexts. And one of the things that I love about text as a medium for games is that it allows you to give your character thoughts and interiority and create a character that has feelings about what's going on around them that are communicated in a way that would be very difficult to do in the context of a graphical game. Maybe you might do a voiceover, but voiceovers tend to be kind of cheesy. And I'm happy to mount a defensive text because I think text is terrific, but I also am not under the illusion that that's the only interesting thing that we could do here. And, as we're looking around and trying to decide what should we do next, given that we have access to this again, we have fewer resources than we did before, but on the other hand, there's also a certain level of freedom about where we are now.
Because you just hinted at that, people ask you, and I remember the Second Life community really was quite thrilled about the possibility that it was speculated that the underlying technology may benefit Second Life and the non-player characters in Second Life. A lot of people complain that the non-player characters in Second Life is very, very limited what you can do with scripting. I remember a great project with the Federation of American Scientists. They populated an entire village in ancient Mesopotamia. You could ask some questions in Second Life and then they would respond, but it was really limited. So we were all kind of hoping that this relationship that you had would result in a more complex AI in Second Life.
Yeah, no, I'm aware that those conversations took place because I did see some of the blog posts that went on. I wasn't really in a position where I was allowed to comment on what was going on inside London, and for that matter, I'm still not. So I'm forced to, sort of be vague about that. There's a lot of potential, especially now that we've had some time with it and learned a lot about sort of first of all, just sort of refined the simulation engine, but also learned a lot about what kinds of situations is this good for on its own? What kinds of situations do you need to have an additional tool in order to sort of create a stronger structure around it? We're in a position where we've learned quite a lot over the last couple of years about what this could plug into, what it could be good for. And you just have to see what makes sense to pursue first, really.
Well, I'm so selfish, but I really want to kind of recreate some of my family members and populate them in Second Life. And my co-host, Joe Yardley, who runs 1920s Berlin in Second Life, she wants real characters from the 20s in Germany in that interbellum period to run around her 1920s Berlin sim. And that would be so awesome if that would work.
There are a lot of directions to dream about. I can't, make any grand announcements or plans or promises at this juncture.
Is there a future where you, with this technology, would be able to offer other people to write their own stories?
Well, that was certainly something we were working on when we were at Linden, and we had a closed beta period where we were trying to share the tools and allow people to work with them. That's something that needs a bit more work and a bit more support. And there are also, again, I have to be kind of careful about what I'm actually allowed to say. There are some limits on what we can do given the terms of our agreement with Linden. So I don't know, basically, but just from a personal perspective of what I, as Emily, wish could happen, I know there are tons of people who would love to use this tool. One of the most annoying things to me about having it shut down was losing access to it myself, right? Like, Blood and Laurels is not the only story like this that I want to write. I have other ideas for which Versu is really the best tool, and it's so frustrating to, after having had access to that, go back to the much clunkier ways of scripting conversation that exist in other types of IF engines. So I would love to see a future in which other people do have an opportunity to explore that. And I just have to see what's going to make sense and what's going to work within the agreements that we've made. So.
Right. Inara Pei, who is a Second Life blogger and a big fan of yours, she wrote me a couple questions when I told her that I'm going to interview you. She just asked here plans for Android release down the road.
Again, that's something that I would really love to see happen, and it's just going to depend on what our resources are. We need to balance what we have time for and what we have the skills to do. But I would love to see that. I have always wanted it to be available on more platforms than the iPad.
In terms of team, you're still the principal in-house novelist, right?
Well, yes. That said, we have Bramble House, which is the work of Jake Forbes, who's still a Linden. So that's going to be coming out. We may also wind up repackaging some of the content that Deirdre Kiai wrote for us. That doesn't mean that everything that we put out is going to be by me, but of the people who are on the permanent team, yes.
And Inar also asked the question, the keynote address at ICIDS in November, any clues what you will be discussing there? As someone who writes their TED Talks a night before they happen.
I was only invited to this quite recently, so I don't know exactly. Yes, I don't know is the short answer. I'm sure that it will be interesting to talk about sort of what's going on with Versu, but also more broadly what's going on in procedural storytelling generally. There's a ton of really interesting stuff happening.
That's what she actually wrote me here. She's referencing a paper that Richard wrote, a simulationist interactive drama, and so hinting at what applications could be used in the future to or study a range of real-world social and other situations. How much do you see your technology in the future to analyze and study and maybe study different outcomes of a real-world situation? I mean, I can just think maybe plug in some parameters real quick of an issue within a kind of a social group or something, or a culture, or maybe even a country, and then let the engine calculate different outcomes.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's...
Whoa, now I'm just thinking of war games. Which we recently watched on movie night. Okay, sorry, go ahead. This gets into sort of speculative things that could be done with Versu rather than what it's currently right this second set up to do. But the Versu engine is capable under the hood of doing multiplayer as well as AI characters. And something that we talked about a long time ago, sort of in the early days of the project, was something where you would be able to play in multiplayer and you would be able to actually add new content to the story. So if you got to a point where you were playing with somebody and you wanted to say something that wasn't already coded into that scenario, that you would actually be able at that moment to write a new piece of content. And that was something that
that we saw as having some really interesting applications, both as a kind of way of exploring, letting people role play scenarios in lots of different directions and sort of create their own model of a particular type of social practice. You could imagine authoring a story that way too, a co-authoring with somebody where you each sort of take turns writing character content and building a story out that way. And that could become an interesting sort of tool. But in terms of analysis of what could possibly happen, there are other approaches besides the Versu-like approach. If you've run into Jeff Orkin's The Restaurant Game, so this was a project by Jeff Orkin, who is at least was at MIT at the time. I don't know whether he still is. But what he did was he made a restaurant scenario that actually had a 3D model and also the ability to type things that the other character would see. And it was just a simple sort of scene of people in a restaurant. Guy comes in, orders some dinner, waitress brings it, that kind of thing. But the deal was that it was entirely run by real humans. Like you would log in and you would be cast as either the guest or the waitress. And you would just have a restaurant-based interaction of, offering each other food and paying the bill and all of those kinds of things. And this was a way for him to collect a huge amount of data about how people thought it was appropriate to interact in a restaurant. And then went back and tagged all of that content up. And then that turned around and became the input for AI behavior. So that now with all of those, numerous examples of AI as authored by individual human players, it creates a scenario where there are many responses to things that somebody who is just sort of writing the game as an authored experience might not have thought of. And he gave a demo of this at GDC where you could go in as the guest at the restaurant and go to the back of the restaurant and steal their microwave and run away. And the waitress would run after you and shout at you because that was something that had actually happened in some scenario role played by humans. And therefore, the AI knew what to do in that context. And it was really funny. There are a number of different approaches to this. There's the kind of backward approach like that, what I was just describing, where just find out what people do and then categorize and tag it. And then there's, what we're doing, a lot of what we built into the conversation engine and the turn taking was based on looking at people's actual academic research into semantics and dialogue flow and trying to program that forward and say, okay, well, these seem to be the rules of how people interact. How do we encode that?
I heard yesterday, and I kind of asked this before, but it came to my mind. Yesterday, I listened to On the Media, one of my favorite public radio shows, and they had a segment about all these services that allow you to kind of plug in all your social media stuff, and then they kind of create sort of a repository of yourself after you die. One service that really, claims to have... They have so much information that your children, your grandchildren would be able to interact with you at some point. I mean, when I listen to you here, isn't there a possibility in the future that your technology could also do something like that? If I were, during my lifetime, I'm just authoring my own AI, and then my children, my grandchildren could plug me after my death, plug me into a story and interact with me.
I don't know whether to be really excited or really horrified by that suggestion.
I'm with you all the way. I'm really kind of totally torn because there's also, the military is apparently building such things so when a soldier dies in combat, the children can then have their father back. I find that incredibly creepy.
Well, okay, let's be clear. It's not going to be their father back.
No, I know, but that's what they, this is hugely problematic because we're using people as cannon fodder, and then we're kind of like, okay, so your daddy's gone, but here you go, here got a little game for you. I mean, that is intensely problematic.
I also am slightly horrified by the notion of plugging in this sort of all your social networks, big data content into something like that. Are you really happy about the idea that some drunken frat party picture of yourself that was posted by your friend when you were 18, then becomes part of your legacy? I could imagine something where you've created lots of interactive conversation where you could tell stories from your childhood or give your opinion on various topics and that kind of thing. And that isn't itself terribly far-fetched from where we are now. That's still going to be a far cry from it fully embodying your personality. And it's not going to be something where, or at least from where the tech is now, Like, it's not the case that you could make a little AI version of yourself that then would be able to dynamically respond to like requests for advice from your great grandchildren involving things that you didn't anticipate. Like, that's just not where we are at this point. Whether we ever will be is another question. But there are a lot of dystopian possibilities that worry me more than the possibility of some sort of, I mean, the sort of movie fantasy, oh no, like this AI got independent intelligence in the net and now it's going to attack. Like, that's nonsense. Like, that's not going to happen.
I hear you. I mean, I'm more concerned about global warming than about that, but that's really in popular culture up front and center.
People who've actually worked on these problems, it's so hard to get the machine to act even remotely intelligent that the idea that it's suddenly going to spring into, you know, frightening levels of sentience is just, that's not a fear that I have. Now, I do fear things like, what are the corporate and government applications of the amount of information that we can have about people, and, you know, how is that going to interface with the kinds of products that might come out of this? Like, those concerns, I think, are completely valid.
Mm-hmm. Loki, just earlier, a friend of mine from Second Life sent me a article in The Independent. Computer becomes first to pass Turing test in artificial intelligence milestone. Eugene Gostman, a computer program pretending to be a young Ukrainian boy, successfully duped enough humans to pass the iconic test. Is that the beginning of the end?
These tests tend to be extremely constrained, right? Like, usually what you've got is a situation where people are interacting with a chatbot in very mediated circumstances, and even managing to surprise people in that context is quite challenging. You know, if you talk about the level of intelligence that a person has, it involves an ability to interact and deal with all kinds of surprising situations. And that's not what these kinds of programs are up for, really.
Maybe then we should go away from standardized tests in the American school system.
Yes, I don't disagree.
But now, in closing, Blood and Laurels, which is, as this goes to air, is already available. How does it look when you compare it to the Versu app?
It's similar. There are some tweaks to the UI. Obviously, we've tried to streamline a little bit sort of how many clicks are required to get things to happen, because that was something that players found a little bit frustrating. So it's designed to be a little bit smoother in that regard. But it is quite similar in that, you know, you're looking at text, and then when you're ready to take action, you bring up a menu. One thing that is different is that Blood and Laurels, and this is true of Bramble House also, it's a multi-part story. And what that means is you play the first part, and that unlocks certain character states and certain possibilities that you can explore in the second part. If you play the first part multiple times, you actually unlock different aspects, different sort of starting states for the second part. It's got some extra screens to represent that possibility of, you know, if you start part 2 when you're friends with this person or you're enemies with that person, you can experience that. And it also keeps track of your achievements so that you can see what kinds of outcomes you've managed to reach versus what's still out there.
What is the story about? What kind of story is it? Where does it take place? So
it's set in a slightly alternate version of ancient Rome, Imperial Rome, at a time when there are a lot of political stresses going on. And it is imagining a time when there is a different emperor on the throne who is not a historical emperor, but it's bringing in a lot of events and possibilities and versions of events that actually happened. And you are a poet who works for an influential general, and one evening he brings you in and he tells you that he wants you to consult with a particular oracle and find out whether if he tried to overthrow the emperor, whether that would work. So suddenly you're sucked into this problem of political intrigue that is clearly very dangerous to get involved with, and you really don't want to have any part of it, but there you are, you're thrown into it. And so the question of sort of what are you going to do from there? How are you going to position yourself amongst a lot of much more powerful people, and are you going to survive the story or not?
When I hear you talk, I'm reminded of what Ready Player One depicts, that you can take part in a fully immersive holodeck type experience of playing one guy within. In the book, it's war games, but it could be anything, that you're really playing this through. I mean, in whatever, in 20 years when we have full immersion with whatever contact lenses and motion capture?
Well, I mean, I think the holodeck dream, the dream of I can walk into this space and do anything I want and it will make an
That's
awesome...
what I've been dreaming about since I'm 11 years old. Don't disappoint me now.
This is something that I love. I've had this conversation with so many people because it's such a, I think it's such a common dream to be able to do that. And at the same time, from a game design perspective, it's really overwhelming to think about, like, how do I make a game? Like, if I make something that is fully holodeck-like, right, then I have to account for the possibility that instead of engaging in my story about conspiracies, that this player is going to wander over and, like, start rummaging through my carefully implemented ancient Roman dump and, like, looking at garbage.
That's the dynamic between Second Life enthusiasts and people who try to make games in Second Life and game designers who looked at Second Life and said, no, I can't design a game there because that's exactly the problem. I cannot guarantee that the player will not follow me a little bit and they're instead rummaging through the garbage pile.
I think when people imagine their idealized holodeck experience, it's one in which somehow or other everything that they do nonetheless leads to this awesome, exciting, well-paced story. And it's very difficult for me to imagine exactly how that could work. Within certain constraints, it is possible to make something very exciting happen, which is, Blood and Laurels is a very branchy story. And if it allows you to make friends with people, it allows you to make enemies of people, it allows you to get poison and poison people at a dinner party, and you could, pick which one you want to kill and whatever, right? And so it's got a level of, within the confines of the type of story we're telling, within that space, you're allowed to do a big range of different types of things. And that's what I think. And that includes exploration. Like, if you want to wander around spaces in certain parts of the game where you're at liberty, then...
Exactly. And it might be the player's preference that in a future holodeck version of Blood and Laurels, for some people, it might be completely awesome to just hang out at the dinner conversation for 2 weeks before moving on to the other conspiracies.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that we did with Blood and Laurels that I think is a design improvement over some of our previous stuff, but which does speak to exactly what you're talking about, is the player often has an option, which is basically going to be the ability to bring whatever scene they're in to a close, but they can pick whether they want to do that right away or whether they want to hang out talking with people, they want to try to influence people or explore the space, or they're like, no, I'm done with this scene, I want to see what happens next, I'm going to move on. Putting that control in the hands of the player means that as the game designer, you're not trying to encode the system to guess when the player is ready to move on. You're letting them actually make that decision for themselves and have that freedom.
So what fascinates me, just two more questions. When you, maybe a little bit more detail, when you write the story then, is it really, if you could step me through the process a little bit, are you then going to put your writer's hat on and it's a fairly traditional sort of solitary thing where you just write the story and come up with the plot and then you plug it into this engine?
It's a little bit more sort of joined up and iterative than that. I mean, it's not like I sort of sit in a room for a week and create this big pile of code and then try it out for the first time. It's more, I build a scene and then I play with it. I see how it goes. I decide what I like, what I don't like. I tweak it. So it's, there's more going back and forth between the writerly experience and the sort of play testing.
Right. That would prevent also that you write yourself into a corner, I suppose.
This is my process with almost everything that I create, not just Versu content, but I think it's really important as an author, you are your own first player, right? And if you aren't constantly experiencing what the interaction feels like, then you're just going to be completely out of touch with what you're trying to build. One of the nice things actually about the prompter system is that it makes it really quick to create a new compilation of the story and then just click through and try it immediately and see whether it's doing what you want it to do. There's always a little bit of a process of discovery to this. As sort of as you're writing it, you realize, there's an angle on this that I want to explore that I didn't think of before. But I generally have some kind of notion of where it's all going.
Final question. I just finished an amazing novel, The Kindly Ones, by an American author who lives in France, and it's in first person from an SS officer, and it's 1,300 pages, and it's gruesome. Would you ever consider creating a story with a really unsympathetic hero, with somebody that you really detest, but you're forced into his point of view and go through the whole story? I mean, this is what this novel, The Kindly Ones, really does. I mean, you really experience the horror of the Nazi regime through the eyes of someone who is really at the front lines in a very high position. You're thrown, between this fascination for power and of course the sheer horror of what he does.
It's a really big ask to put that kind of thing into an interactive form. It's already demanding a lot of the reader to say, here, come along with me for 1,300 pages inside the mind of this horrible person. But then when you go beyond that and say, okay, now I'm going to invite you as the player to actually command these horrible actions. That takes it to another level of sort of demanding complicity in these kind of horrific things. And that's an interesting territory, actually, something that the IF community has explored in various ways over the years, of games that ask you to experience being somebody that you don't really want to be, or games where you're kind of lured. I mean, a trick that some games do with this is that they sort of set things up initially as just challenges, like, can you accomplish X? Can you accomplish Y? Can you solve this puzzle? And you only realize kind of as you go along, hey, wait, there's actually also an ethical question of like whether I even should be doing this. But you're kind of sucked into, the lure of trying to solve it gets you to ignore the ethical puzzle of it. So there's this wonderful detective story called Make It Good by John Ingold, it's a very difficult game. And the difficulty of it kind of has this wonderful effect of masking from you the fact that you're playing as this quite corrupt, drunk detective who really does not have a lot going for him and has some pretty unsavory motivations. And so you kind of get to the end and you're like, yes, I solved this really hard game, but maybe I should not have done that. So it's possible to do that kind of thing. It's not easy. And I think it's something where, I mean, we talk about literacy with respect to sort of being able to read things intelligently, but there's also kind of an interactive literacy, which has to do with, is your player sort of conscious enough of some of the different tropes and possibilities and range of interactive literature that they're not just looking for, I'm going to have a good time with this chirpy game, but I want to like really explore something difficult through interactivity. And I think that's the kind of audience that you would have to go for with something that was that challenging.
So that was Emily Short, and that's the show for today. Lots is, of course, happening in the blogosphere. The viewer-managed marketplace is on its way. We'll have Brooke Linden on after the summer break to talk about it. We have Variety reporting on Project Sansar, MMORPG.com as well, and some little German outlets. So lots of press for Linden Lab. Linden Lab is also releasing video ads. They've released two, one shorter, one a little longer, and uses footage from some of the Drax Files video series. The videos are edited by Torley with the help of Brett. Great job. I'm going to get my PC now, which was fried by the heat here. Insane heat. The PC couldn't make it anymore, but not to worry, because I'll be back in Second Life on Sunday for sure for the giant snail race. We have a new sponsor, Racer X Going. He has been putting on this race since 2004. To me, the giant snail race kind of represents SL in a nutshell. I mean, the fact that you have a world where you can watch giant snails racing and cheer them on and be part of a global audience, that's just awesome. So go and watch some giant snail races. We have a bunch more sponsors. Please check them out. Consider helping us as well. In the background today, to go out, we have some music. The tune Strictly Genteel. It's nothing to do with Second Life, but it's a Frank Zappa tune, of course, from the soundtrack of 200 Motels, which featured Theodore Bickel as Rance Mohammeds. And Theodore Bickel passed away at the age of 91 this past week. Actor, singer, political activist, important man who made this Zappa movie into a work of utter mad genius. Rest in peace, Theodore. And dear listeners, have a fabulous weekend. Bye.
Lord, have mercy on the people in England for the terrible food these people must eat. And may the Lord have mercy on the fate of this movie, and God bless the mind of the man in the street.
The Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley is a weekly production of Basic Drax Entertainment. The show is supported by Dwarfins, Leap Motion, Dutchy Furniture, Stitcher, Strawberry Sing, Fate Wear by Damien Fate, Giza Creations, Arrows Avatars, Maven Homes, Mad Pea Productions, Girls Identity Circus, Ison, Caravel Design, Vika Creations, Humanoid Animations, Loki Elliott, Botanical, Death Row Designs, Fallen Gods Incorporated, What's Next, Abranimations, The Den, Cube Republic, Avacon, and Landscapes Unlimited. Contact the show via Skype, DraxFiles, Avatar DraxFiles, or email radio@draxfiles.com.